Welcome to Directionally Correct, a People's podcast with Cole and Scott. Today's guest, Jane Datta, former Chief Human Capital Officer at NASA.
Thanks to our sponsors, One Model. One Model helps people leaders at large organizations make consistently brilliant talent decisions by unlocking the analytical value of the data dispersed across your business. One Model's people analytics platform takes all of the heavy lifting out of data extraction, cleansing, modeling, analytics, and reporting of enterprise workforce data. One Model pioneered people data orchestration and has perfected the ethical use of AI and data science for leaders who need transparent and explainable decision support systems. HR and business teams trust its accurate reports, analyses, and storytelling capabilities. Data scientists, engineers, and people analytics professionals love the combination of governance and flexibility that no other workforce insights platform can provide. To learn more, book a demo at onemodel.co/directionally correct. All opinions are our own and do not reflect those of any other organization.
In some senses, what you've done is you're almost like inviting listeners to drop into a conversation, an informal conversation that people are having in an airport or anywhere, right? You sort of like a collegial kind of banter, if you will. And maybe, I don't know, just my perspective, maybe it isn't about being exciting. It's just about being interesting and informative. You know, you always know when you've listened in on a conversation or participated in one where you're like, that really felt good. It didn't have to reveal anything marvelous, but it felt good. I got something out of it. I retained something.
Speaking of interesting, tell me about this painting behind you. Is this your own artwork?
Well, really, I wish it were, but it is not. It is an original. It's an acrylic, but I got it on the internet. And from one of those artwork sites. And, when I got myself set up, I took over one of my kids' bedrooms as my office in the pandemic period. They're gone. So that's now mine. And so I wanted to set it up to be Zoomable.
Yeah. Did the kids revolt upon this? Or like, God, leaving up all my posters of Michael Jordan or whatever?
I don't think so. We were lucky that way. Like when my daughter went to college, my son took over her room. So in some senses, we'd sort of set it up to not be too connected to your old bedroom, right? That was already a thing before I stepped in and then took over the smaller of the two. But
before we started recording the podcast, we were having a conversation about what does it mean to have an interesting conversation?
Yeah.
So what in your mind, what makes something boring versus interesting in terms of a conversation, especially with the people you work with, what crosses that chasm?
To me, it's that there is an uncovering something that the participants actually care about. Right. We can all talk about the weather and, the sort of the pleasantries. And that's good because it helps build a picture of a person. So it's more like they become more relatable. But in the end, what makes it memorable is when you've gotten to something that matters, where someone has something to say that they want to get out and say out loud and have someone react to. And that makes it, you can almost tell when there's oh, this is just a sort of side issue. I don't really care one way or another. I'm just opining on it because that's where we are. But versus, hey, I've hit something I care about and I have energy for this subject. That makes it more memorable. I don't know. That's how I feel about it anyway. Does that make sense?
Oh, it makes perfect sense. Well, I guess it leads me to think why do you care about the human capital space, or why do you care about workforce planning? What makes it meaningful?
Well, I find it, I have just intellectual curiosity about it, right? I always have, ever since I started working in the field. I don't know why I care. I just don't know. It's kind of like, why do you like pizza? Why do you like classical music? Why do you like these things? I am an amateur classical piano player.
Yeah, didn't you study that in school or something like that?
I studied music,
okay.
And I did have credits from taking classes and performing, but I was never a performer, as the primary thing that I did for my degree. And ever since, it's been very just a hobby. And so you might ask, well, it's a hobby. It's a pretty precise thing that you do. Why? And I literally could not explain why it is that I am compelled to sit down at the keyboard and have those 88 keys tell me things. I mean, I just don't know why, but it's there. And so it's just, there's something about the shapes and patterns of workforce planning and kind of the way in which it plays out. Human capital generally, it speaks to kind of what are the creative things that I did in that part of my career, and I care about them and I care about what happens to them. So there's some part of it is just seeing history through my contributions, and some of it is just that natural curiosity, seeing what's happening in today's world. It's really a little different, certainly different than when I started out, and even since I left, full-time employment. So
I feel the same way. I don't know what compels me to sit down, but it's 26 keys plus the 10 number keys every day, right?
Yeah. You're sitting down at your computer, at your station. Yeah, exactly. Why
We're
is
making
that?
magic, though.
And to some extent, I couldn't make up reasons why, but maybe I don't care. I just like it. And it is what it is,
Well, I mean, I guess if I had to pontificate, music's not that different from, arranging an organization. Like, you got to have it all organized and the harmonies flow. This is a stretch. Don't get me wrong.
No. Yeah. Yeah. Well, there's a storytelling aspect to performing. You wouldn't think of it that way because unless it's got text, someone singing, you don't think of it like that. But when you're studying it, it's about phrases and highlights where you're moving. Why? What's the emotion? Like, a lot of times, I still take lessons. I think that you've never mastered anything. So you're always good to be a student, right? So some of the things are, okay, what's the image that comes to mind? What are you trying to convey? How does it feel to the listener, to you, when you get to this section, and why, and where's it going? So it's this sense that you are really trying to tell a story through the music and
technique. I've heard really high end piano players talk or critique other piano players of oh, they didn't leave enough sustain here, or didn't hit the keys hard enough, or didn't let it linger long enough.
Yep. Oh, there's just so much to cover in all the technical things that you do. You have to make it sound like you're not okay, now I'm doing this with my fingers. But you have to make it sound organic, but it isn't. It's very.
I tell you, as a kid, we had an upright piano in the house, and I never learned to play a lick. Don't get me wrong, but I was fascinated with the bench, and you could open up the bench, and they had all the sheet music in the bench, and that was the extent of my musical career as far as the piano, anyway. But I just found it never-endingly fascinating.
Yeah.
Well, I think there's something there about the harmony, the chord, the discord, the relationship, the balance. I think all that makes sense in terms of why it would be naturally or intrinsically, you want to make the relationship between the employer and the employees harmonious, and the structure, and then, making sure that it's not just all chaos all at once, pressing all the 88 keys all at the same time.
Right.
I don't know. What do you think? What do you think the relationship is between you mentioned earlier there was the world of work right now isn't the same as it was when you started, right? And I know prior to this, Jane, when you and I had spoken, we had talked about, workforce planning seems to be hot again, right? It seems to be very on the cutting edge again. It was in the past, and then it kind of, all these things kind of have an ebb and flow to them. What's going on right now that makes this moment in workforce planning so relevant?
So I think it's a couple of things. First of all, I think that topics such as workforce planning or DEI or any of these things that might impact the human capital world are cyclic, right? And so I think what happens at a macro level is that there's a lot of energy, and then people get exhausted. They can only get so far in that cycle with what they can do with it. And so it recedes to the background some. And then there's this renewed interest in it. So that because you've allowed it to kind of percolate in the background in long enough that you then bring it back and have refreshed ideas and new things. So that's one thing. I think it's just part of a cycle. The other couple of ideas that I have about why now is that I do think there's a certain amount of environment-wide disruption going on. It started with the pandemic, and I think it's now walking from that into the AI and the very fast adoption of AI tools in all of their different forms and in all their glory that has introduced a kind of like all of the norms that I'm used to that I would plan against seem to be shifting. It's also a whole bunch of opportunity that was never there before. So opportunity to explore different things that are impacting how I might construct a plan or what scenarios I might look at, ways that I could actually address gaps and surpluses. I have more things to choose from than I ever did before. And I have better data and I have quicker access to it if I believe it, and you have to approach everything with a little skepticism. So I think it's a combination of new stuff that's making me look at an old subject with new eyes, availability of data, which was always a big deal, in the workforce planning world. Can I get it? How much do I have to pay for it if it's external? There's just a lot more out there that I can use. And I think that in this time of disruption, I really think it is a time of disruption now, more disruptive than others times in my lifetime, my working life, that when things feel really disrupted, I want to do something that makes me feel like I have a better handle on it. And any planning function could serve that purpose. It could be financial planning. It could be technology planning. It could be any planning in the sort of business realm I would include in this, because it's a way of imposing some kind of structure on the uncertainty so that I feel that I have a little bit more, if not control, than insight in what to do. So those are some thoughts.
Like Mike Tyson says, like everyone has a plan until you get punched in the face, right? And I think AI is a punch to the face.
It is.
Stephen Toddy just came out with an article in Org Dynamics called Avoiding Conflict and the Transition to AI. And he paints a very kind of bleak picture of essentially employees being replaced by AI. We've had other folks on the podcast come and say like, no, it's going to augment you and this sort of stuff. But yeah, I don't know, man.
Yeah.
I don't know.
Well, let me dig into this for a second, because a minute ago, Jane, you mentioned, there were things normatively that you used to plan for, and maybe if you were doing it today, you would have to plan for completely different things. Can you give some examples of those? I mean, you came from NASA. I'm sure it's a fascinating organization. I want to dig into that in a minute. But what are some of the things that you used to plan for that maybe wouldn't be relevant and that you would be planning for today?
Well, I would say, certainly from a NASA perspective, I would be much more interested in understanding the labor market dynamics than I was before. When you work in a government agency, particularly one like NASA, that is the workforce has been really stable. So, it's a combination of low attrition. I mean, even in different economic environments, it would go from 5% from 3% attrition, but it's still low, if you see what I mean. So low attrition. It's a tenure-based system. I mean, I use the word tenure. That's not the technical term for it, but essentially,
isn't a BFSS a bona fide seniority-based system or something like that?
It's a system whereby you get to say when you leave. You can be asked to leave because they have made a case that there's a case that you have had really poor performance, or you've done some conduct that is, unacceptable. And they do have some tools, but they're really bad tools, like what they call reduction in force, which is the technical term that is used in government for layoffs. But there are all sorts of rules around that, which make it a very not user friendly or effective method for reshaping. So So essentially, you have to work with the patterns of attrition that you are handed.
Well, why is that? Like, is it adaptive for an organization like NASA to have low attrition rates? I mean, you're probably talking about a very select group of individuals, right? Highly skilled, select skill,
Yeah.
hard to replace.
Yes, that is true. And, we have very long-term programs, they go for decades.
Yeah.
And so you have people who feel a commitment to those programs and they want to stay because there aren't
Like,
programs like it.
sir, you've been performing poorly since 1992. It's finally time to separate.
Can I give a relevant example from a fictional movie?
Yeah, sure.
Why this is important?
Okay.
So in the movie The Martian with Matt Damon, he goes and for those who haven't watched the movie, like they're on Mars and everybody leaves without him and he's abandoned. And so he goes and finds an old Mars rover from like the 1990s and turns it on again. And the only way that NASA is able to communicate with them is they actually have to find workers who worked on that Mars rover from back in the 90s who are able to communicate with them through that. That's a workforce planning problem. Right now, it's probably not a realistic one because it's a fictional movie, but you have to think a lot of these programs that Jane mentioned, they are multi-decade, right? I mean,
Right.
I was even like there was like the Pioneer and there were all these like satellites that got shot outside of the solar system back in like the 70s. People have to be able to communicate with those even today. So I mean, these are very long term programs. I'm probably stomping on what you want to say, or Dane, but
No, you're not stomping on anything. You're absolutely right. It doesn't mean that there aren't shifts that are needed. And what I would argue, and did while I was still in the role of the Chico, is that we are now at an era, especially in human spaceflight, where who does what is shifting. So it started with the commercial crew and cargo program and is extended into the Artemis program. But that is that in the traditional NASA world, the work that NASA was given budget to perform was performed by people in the agency and by a wide range of, traditional contracting firms, right? So you had this public-private duality always. But the commercial program model is different. It's essentially saying we want commercial partners, think Boeing, SpaceX, even to some degree Blue Origin, those people that there are companies that are getting into the space business who bring their resources. So it's a real partnership, right? Between public and private. And one of the longer term goals is that work that NASA would have performed historically in a legacy way, we're handing over to these partners to do. So the idea is what the work is that NASA has to do is shifting. And to some degree in a big way. And that was by design. This isn't something that just happened to NASA. This was part of the strategy that multiple presidential administrations supported. And because of that, there was enough continuity that it got legs and it's working. And so, but the sort of the devil's in the details around what are the pieces of work that NASA actually lets go of. And then how do they turn their attention to things that they would not have had the capacity to focus on because they were doing all these other things, right? What does that enable? But also from a workforce planning perspective, what does that mean for the mix and the size of workforce that they need? And it's a shift that's not happening abruptly. But the success of the commercial partnerships is basically telling us that this is here to stay. And so I believe that though, continuity and basically the workforce you have in 2020 is the same that you had in 2080 or 70 or whenever it is, that is actually not a fair statement any longer if you look out. And that's most particularly in the human spaceflight world, less so in the science world. I think that's a more stable part of the NASA workforce requirements for the mission set that they perform. But human spaceflight's it's a really big deal for NASA. And so again, I think there is a need for continuity, especially in these very unusual kind of composite areas of experience with, entry, descent, and landing, and in situ resource utilization, and the things that are highly particularized to space travel. Those are things where you need to maintain expertise, but we're not talking about large volumes, right, of personnel who know how to do that. And in some cases, this is not just people who can do everything in that. It's composites, it's groups of skills that you bring together into more like capabilities. And so really understanding what those capabilities are and how much you need to invest in them, I think is a workforce planning question. So for the rest of the work that is sort of in its migrating to, sharing and then maybe giving over to the commercial partners and others in the space industry is growing. You've got startups and all sorts of different innovative ways to address sort of thorny problems. That means that you have potentially more turnover in, say, young engineers. There are more places for them to go to get that work. Does that make sense?
It does. Well, let's dig into that actually, because some of my wife's relatives actually work at NASA, and if you ever want to see me geek out, we'll have them over, and I'll just ask them about rocket science questions for like 5 hours. But one of the things that I think about is you guys do some fascinating workforce planning for things like astronauts or rocket scientists or the different kinds of engineers. And you mentioned kind of the early career engineering, let's call it a problem of retention of talent and that type of thing. How do you, I imagine just like for something like an astronaut, there must be like a crazy funnel of people getting down to the small number of individuals who ultimately make it into that role. But I'm sure it's like that in other roles in NASA. Is there anything unique to doing workforce planning for those type of roles in that organization?
Yes. The astronaut selection process is a thing in and of itself. It's actually managed entirely by Johnson Space Center in Houston. It has some regulatory boundaries. It also has a selection process that takes a long time and includes elements that are not part of a normal selection process. Medical, for example, would be one. And it undergoes enormous scrutiny because there's so much interest in it from congressional stakeholders, for example. So it's always, walking this fine line between being handling. In 1 year, I remember there were 18,000 applicants. So just think about that for a second. And so,
Why didn't you put my resume up top?
yes. Well, feel free to apply in the next open window. Okay.
Okay.
We'll see what we can do. No, I'm just kidding. But, there are people that have specialized in astronaut selection, and it is a dedicated full-time role for the period of time between, the open window and getting to the announcement of a new astronaut corps. So, clearly there have needed to be we've used technology better in the last 5 to 8 years, and it was all manual before. So there have been some things, but the actual process has some elements that are the same as you would see in any selection process, but it has a lot of extra pieces and as I mentioned, a lot of scrutiny. So it stands alone in terms of the actual hiring and selection process from anything else that we do at NASA. Everything else falls more into more of a standardized bucket of, are we bringing in good talent? We do bring in people at all levels. So we bring in people from commercial entities, we bring in people from academia, but we do a lot of growing from within. So there's a lot of emphasis on internships and on making sure that we have a good pipeline. And the picking of people for that pipeline is what you would expect it to be. You have relationships with colleges and universities. You have a presence there. We've migrated to using LinkedIn so that people can actually have a landing page and we can do more targeted messaging and things like that. So, it's in some ways not different than you would find in any large corporation. We're just trying to pay attention to those segments. I think the challenge for NASA in the last 10 to 15 years has been not bringing people in, but once they are in, particularly in the engineering core and particularly at the human spaceflight field centers, is finding enough what they call hands-on work. So that's the actual touching the hardware and doing the software, because we have always been fairly leveraged in terms of, the civil service contractor ratios, right? So there's a concern that if we are ceding more work to outside entities and not doing it anymore, you could certainly bring in, PhD researchers who are earlier in their career, but what about the engineers, and how do you get them to have enough experience, hands-on experience, that they know what they're doing? So one of the philosophies that I followed when I was there, and I cannot speak for NASA. I do not have any authority or
Go on.
voice for what they're doing. So this is just going back a couple of years.
Disclaimer.
Yes, disclaimer is that I promoted the idea of this porous border concept. And the porous border was, the traditional model was you bring people in at their earliest part of their career and you give them all of the experiences that they need internal to NASA, and then you grow your leaders from within, and hey presto, you have continuity and you have familiarity with all of the big programs and experience. And actually that may not be sustainable for the primary way in which we get and develop people, and that we needed to actually allow for this migration in and out. It's okay that people go and work for SpaceX for a while or go to work for a startup, and then you bring them in and then maybe they go back out again and they work somewhere else.
So is this the NASA program in Montgomery, Alabama? When I was a kid, I wanted to go to this NASA training camp, get me a junior astronaut status, right? Just grow me from within, Jane.
Yeah, you're talking about Space Camp, I think, in Huntsville.
Yeah, I'd go right now. I'd go today. Absolutely.
Then that is, getting the youth of today excited about.
I'm a youth. Yeah.
I know we all are. We're in our
No,
inner
you're not.
kids, right? Getting people excited about space is still, it doesn't matter what model you use.
How hard is that? Come on, hey guys, we're NASA.
Yeah, the NASA has an amazing brand.
How do you select astronauts in teams? You're talking about a situation where you could be up in a little capsule the size of a small school's bus for 8 months at a time, in a situation where a coworker could legitimately turn over to talk to someone else and say, it's your fault that we're all going to die. That's not out of the realm of possibility. And you need hardcore communication, trust, high intelligence. Of course, that trumps everything. Is that how astronauts are selected, or is it just individual? We're just cream of the crop. I don't know how this works.
So what I'll say is that the interpersonal skills of the applicants is a really big deal. It's not just technical skills. They have to be able to get along.
Well, you and I are out, Scott. Sorry, man.
Jane raises a really good point. If you're gonna be stuck somewhere, you hear about the rock bands. They used to fight and break up because they'd be in a bus across the country, and they just you gotta like the person you're with. So yeah, if you're up in the space shuttle, you definitely have to be able to. You gotta be cool.
You have to know. You know what to do in times of great stress. You have to know how to make things operate effectively, both in flight and also when you get to the space station, or for EVAs or anything that you're doing. Cooperation and collaboration is really essential. And it's essential not just for getting missions done, but it's essential for safety. It really is. And so
I think it was Avenue 5 who, like, there's a quote, it's like, they can't hear you scream in space, but they can damn sure see you freak out.
Well, Jane, I want to come back to something. So you mentioned the concept of the porous border.
Yes.
Right. And the ability to go back and forth.
Yes.
And, we've seen tons of stuff lately about, skills-based workforce planning, deconstructing jobs, the, kind of challenging the traditional model of roles in the first place. And how does that play a role in what you're describing in terms of this porous border between what's going on here? And why is it even a relevant topic right now in your mind?
Why is skills-based relevant? Yeah. I would say that we didn't focus on skills-based workforce planning when I was there. I would describe the workforce, we actually established a workforce planning function at the agency way back when. I mean, I'm really going to age myself, but back in the early 2000s. And the three types of workforce planning that we kind of codified for our environment were strategic, programmatic, and operational. So, and the characteristics of each of those layers is probably self-evident, right? I would say that we probably emphasized the operational workforce planning, which was really, NASA, it consists of 10 field centers, and they were the place where the work and the workforce came together. So they were responsible for the hiring and the monitoring and the managing and all of that of the workforce at NASA. And so they were always very concerned from the mission, like getting the mission done. Who's leaving? Are we backfilling or are we forward filling? What are we doing? So it was very, very much near term. I know what my budget is. I know what the mission needs are because it's nearer in. And so that was always the heaviest focus. The secondary, but very secondary focus was kind of the more strategic level where, and, the strategic workforce planning at NASA really didn't have get a lot of attention in times of great stability for obvious reasons. But as we were moving into this less stable era, I think the kind of thing that we did was to look at what would enable us to be more agile. There's a lot we don't know. How quickly is the commercial industry going to be actually ready to take over things? Like, is that 5 years? Is that 10 years? What budget are we going to get when we have a new administration? Are they going to favor NASA? I mean, these are all the things that every government agency goes through. But for NASA, in the middle of this transition, I felt like that was a big deal. And so the workforce planning that we did was really about what could give us a tad more agility than we would normally have. So an example of something that we did was we focused on term limited federal appointments, right? So that would allow us to have something other than the full-time permanent, tenure based, I leave when I want to leave kinds of appointing authorities. And it's not like that was going to solve a lot, but it was just like everything that we could do to give us more options for then responding as the future came nearer. And we realized that the way that we'd always done things wasn't working. We just had more degrees of freedom. The middle layer, the programmatic layer, was very much kind of a rely on key personnel who have the continuity. And so we tried to put together kind of a skills lexicon back in the early 2000s. What we discovered is that the meaning of the skills was very tailored to what part of the business you were in, science versus human spaceflight versus aeronautics research versus anything else, as well as what field center you were at. And so to get to skills-based forecasting, you had to do a lot more change management. That there is such a thing as an enterprise, and that there's some reason to look at those things as an enterprise. And frankly, I don't think we got there. And so we ended up really kind of creating a community, sharing some best practices, embedding some more tools, including some more external data as things heated up. So it was really more of some enablers more than it was a wholly different way of looking at workforce planning with skills.
Do any of the astronauts have any like progressive thoughts, like 4-day work weeks? Like, hey, I want to go home on the weekends.
Yeah, I don't think so. I think you're all in, and whatever it takes, it takes.
Did you call yourself a Chico? I've never heard this term. Is it the Chief Human Resources Officer? What is that?
It's a Chief Human Capital Officer.
Capital Officer.
Yeah. So CHCO, which is familiarly referred to as you're a Chico, the Chief Human Capital Officers Act of 2002, I think it was.
Is that a ubiquitous term, or is that something like bespoke to NASA? I've never heard.
No. That's a government term.
Oh, okay. Okay.
So Chicos are the government, the federal government, I need to say, federal government version of a CHRO.
Have you ever heard of the term Chiro? Chiro, either of you?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
This came up the other day. Someone's like telling me, he keeps saying about Chiro. I have never heard this term before, and no one I know had heard it either.
Yeah, I thought that was a sugary Mexican dessert. Is that right?
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think people struggle with CHRO saying it out loud multiple times in maybe a paragraph feels like a bit of it just doesn't trip off the tongue nicely. So Chiro is just a fast way of saying that acronym. And Chico is easier. I mean, it just sort of, and because it has come into common usage, everybody in the federal government knows what it is. And so there aren't barriers to understanding, at least in the federal government itself.
Oh my God, Jane, like you weren't here for the blooper reel, but me just trying to do our intro today, trying to get out Chief Human Capital Officer at NASA it was comical. We'll just say that.
Yeah, I get it.
We made it through a good 10 or 15 takes for sure.
I'm going to take a couple breaks.
It's harder than you think. Just saying something in order is much more difficult than you might imagine as an adult. Well, before I wanted to get one last thing in here, Jane, before we move on to the confusion matrix, which is I think you're independent now, I believe, in terms of what you're doing in consulting. And, you've been in the private sector earlier in your career. You've been in the public sector for quite some time, and now you're kind of doing the independent thing. What's that like, and how is that different for you in terms of the skill acquisition that I imagine that you're going through as well? So can you talk to us all about that?
Yeah, I mean, I think my experience as a Chico is different than it would have been had I been a Chiro. Somewhat exaggerated. The differences are probably more exaggerated because of where I was the Chico, right? And so the characteristics that I shared about NASA and the patterns of workforce are mirrored in other government agencies, but they might, for instance, have very high turnover rates, right? So I do not speak for the whole federal government when I describe my experience at NASA. Having said that, I think there are some things that are different about being a Chico than I anticipate being a Chiro, though I never was one. So, clearly there is a regulatory framework in which every part of a government agency operates. So, for instance, in HR, so much of what we talk about in HR is fundamentally about hiring. Because even workforce planning, it's who you hire, right? Yes, how you develop them, how you nurture them, how you create a culture, all that's, those are all important elements. But everybody cares about hiring. And in the federal government, there's a regulatory framework around what are the authorities you have to use for hiring, and what are the natures of those authorities, and are you approaching hiring with use of the merit systems principles so that there's no bias and that you giving opportunity to as wide a swath of people as you possibly can. And when I tell you that there's a regulatory framework, especially in hiring, I am not kidding you. It is audited by OPM.
In the government? No way.
Yes.
No way.
Never. But, and I'm not I'm not characterizing this as bad. It's just that this is the world in which you live. That's the reality of it. And so you have to have a great deal of respect for the underlying principles that explain why the regulations and the laws are what they are. You have to embrace that. Like, why would I care to protect veterans' preference? Why? Why would I care to ensure that I have really precise practices on how I recruit and interview and select people for a federal appointment, right? Why do I do those things? What are all of the philosophies that underlie that? Which, yes, a Chiro, by contrast, would certainly care about not running afoul
Of
of
course.
laws, discriminatory laws, for example. But it feels different. And there are a number of areas of HR that have more of a regulatory basis, hiring being the most obvious one, but performance management and employee relations. And there are other areas where there are really, really clear boundaries and guidelines for how you operate. There are some areas like training and development where that's a lot less the case. And in fact, workforce planning, where I grew up within the federal sector, is not a sort of regulated function because it's a planning function. So anyway, I would say that understanding the regulatory framework and the philosophies, I think, also changes is perhaps more evolutionary than revolutionary in the federal government space generally. Mm-hmm. Patterns of the employee life cycle are different. And, I think there's some goodness. You're not always having to show results for the next quarterly earnings report or whatever. Mm-hmm. You're not doing this. Oh, we're doing layoffs. Oh, it's a war for talent. Oh, we're doing layoffs. No, you don't have that cycle to contend with. So you sort of are working with and helping to kind of shape and, for lack of a better term, chivvy along your HR programs. So you have some time, you have some thought, you can experiment with things. There are fewer consequences. And in that way, it's kind of it's not that there are no expectations in reporting. I don't mean to imply that. It's just that the pattern is different. The time scale is a little longer. It does require an enormous amount of long-term thinking and patience to see things through. There's often not a lot of funding that you get. So,
yeah, I used to work for an organization where we developed assessments, and the time scales were like 2 to 3 years. So, like, if you didn't get to it this week, it's okay. You get to it next week.
Right. And the one thing that I sort of regretted is that, the legacy tech footprint is generally not modern in most agencies. And it is hard with the way things work to shift that. But, and if you looked at all the business functions, I would say HR wouldn't necessarily get the love before others, depending upon where an agency is and what its key issues are. Maybe it would, but having enough sustained funding for really changing your tech footprint is hard. So.
Yeah, that in itself is its own workforce planning challenge, is just having people who can service the legacy tech because you had to build it yourself.
Yeah.
But why don't we move on and do some confusion matrix? What do you have for us today, Scott?
The confusion matrix. Real quick, we wanted to say thanks again to One Model, the AI and people analytics pioneer, for sponsoring the episode. And now back to the confusion matrix.
Yeah. All right, Jane. I don't know why, but I started fixating on high school the other day when I was like trying to write these out. So these are like 5 questions, just reminiscing about the good old days, right? Or the horrible days, whatever. Okay, Jane. Both y'all can answer rather. Were you popular? Were you a popular kid?
No.
In school? No?
Nope. No, I wasn't really interested in doing the things that you had to do to be popular.
Yeah.
And so I just had my circle of friends, and that was good for me.
Do you ever follow up with people that were popular in high school? Like, whatever happened to them? Like, did they peak?
It's long enough ago, can I say? But not really. There was a reunion back in the early 2000s, and I didn't attend, but I talked to folks who did.
Oh my god! Like, that was like, hey, what are you doing? Well, I'm a middle manager at some little like sales organization. What do you do? I'm the fucking Chico at NASA. That's what's up. I mean, it's a perfect opportunity.
Yeah. Well, I wasn't at that point, but yes, I get your point. Your bigger point.
I work at NASA.
Jane won the superlative of most likely to work for NASA someday.
No doubt.
She fulfilled that dream.
If I gave you control of the radio in high school, what are you putting on the radio?
Oh, I'd go classical, though I do have other musical interests, but I definitely go classical, and it would be piano classical because that's what I love. And there are an outrageous number of incredible artists out there. I mean, and it is so available. Like when I'm learning something, I can go to Spotify, I can go to YouTube, I can do a whole bunch of things, and you can hear a real range. So I'd pick something that I loved.
What do you think of Max Richter?
Max Richter. Should I
You
know
know him? Oh, he's a famous classical artist right now. He does a lot of movie scores as well.
Yeah, there are a lot of them out there, and some of them are really, that are all ages. I mean, there's a baffling number of young artists coming into prominence as well. It's just extraordinary. So,
absolutely.
What's the weirdest thing you wore to high school that you thought was cool? Like, you're like, I'm hot shit.
Well, let me answer that by saying I think I was pretty conservative in what I wore, but I really struggled. I really wanted to have something that distinguished me. And so I tried all sorts of things with my hair.
Oh, nice.
Thanks.
Nice.
Like there was one point where I thought, if you look at the back of my head, it's just a whole bunch of brown. So I need to do something. So I like pin things on the back of my head. So I don't think that I would win the fashion prize for what I tried, but that was where I focused my energies.
Yeah.
I went green hair at one point myself. So
Did you?
Did you do it with a mohawk?
No mohawk. I had, oh my god, I look at some of the old photos, like, how'd you let me out of the house, Mom? Oh my Lord, like, you did me dirty by not.
If your parents were like my parents, they didn't want to let me out of the house.
Right.
Yeah, gosh.
What about you, Cole? Do you have any like crazy clothes? You were like kind of in the emo phase.
Yeah, I was
right?
always into that stuff. So think of any stereotype about that, and yeah, it probably is true. So I don't know. It's very embarrassing in retrospect. Or
do y'all have any like weirdest moment in high school? Like just crazy thing that happened?
Weirdest moment.
Or like something that sticks out from that time period.
Yeah. I don't know if it is a good example of what you're asking for, but I'll share it anyway.
Sure.
Name names too.
One of the clubs that I was in was something we called forensics. And to this day, I don't understand why the club was titled that. But anyway, what it was poetry and prose reading.
Oh.
Competitively.
Oh, okay.
So you would go to these meets and you'd prepare your selection, and then you would get, you get feedback and you get a rating, and someone would win. So, and I remember,
Did you win?
Pardon me?
Did you win?
I did. I won the state, but before, I don't know if it was before or after that, we were in a regional competition, and I brought a selection that included a 4-letter word.
Oh.
I think it was damn, but anyway, it just, I mean, it wasn't extraordinary to our modern day ears, and there was a somewhat
a little risque for high school for sure.
Well, yeah. And I think the venue of where the regional competition was held was conservative, can I say?
Yes.
And I can remember I was knocked out of the running. And so
instant elimination.
I'm not saying that was the only reason. I'm sure that there were other reasons that were very valid, but it stuck
The
with
fix
me.
was in.
Like know your audience. That's what I learned from it. Not don't read selections that have bad words in them, but more have some sense of where you're going and what would resonate with their audience. And that stuck with me all of these years.
That is fascinating. I mean, and like my reaction under probably the same circumstances would have been to rebel even further, but that probably shows the differences between us. So that's really fascinating, Jane. Well, Scott, do you have any more confusion metrics, or you want to do some nerdery?
We can move on. We're good.
The nerdery. I mean, I think
I will say that your weirdest moment and mine are different in the fact that a guy just lit up a cigarette in class and like walked out the door and like out the front door of the high school and nothing happened. That was it. Like nothing happened.
that's kind of like a Ferris Bueller type of moment. It seems like almost, or I don't know. Well, the first nerdery article I've got, and I'm curious, I don't actually know that much, Jane, about your background in the talent space, but I imagine as a Chico that you probably were doing a lot of talent management in addition to the workforce planning. And so there's a gentleman named Mark Efron who leads a group called the Talent Strategy Group. And we covered one of their articles about is the juice worth a squeeze a while back. And I think they published another banger in terms of it's still the mortar, not the bricks. And so my understanding is they published an article called it's the mortar, not the bricks in 2019, talking about HR operating models. And so the most famous of which is the Dave Ulrich, he talks about HR business partners, centers of excellence, and then the shared services.
Right.
And the premise of the article is, there's been a lot of these firms that have been putting out their own revolutionized HR operating models because what HR does is so outdated. And what Mark and the Talent Strategy Group are really advocating for still is instead of putting together new operating models, perhaps we should just be getting good at the ones that we have already. And and really the shortcoming isn't that the operating models are misaligned to the work, it's that we're not putting the models themselves into practice the way that they should be. And I'm curious, Jane, from your perspective, what do you think about this conceptually, first of all? And two, are they onto something? Or are they not onto something? I don't know. What are your thoughts here?
I think they're onto something. And I say that because I respect, say, an org chart, which is an element of an operating model, not everything. I get it. But it's more about catering for all the things that you want to have happen in HR and how you want them to happen than exactly what your operating model is. I'm a huge fan of Dave Ulrich's three-legged stool where you have the three components. But if I looked at, for instance, the center of excellence piece of it, which is sort of the standardized functions, and I do verily believe that you need to have expertise in the functions. And so that's an important part of the operating model, no matter how you lay it out and how you build an org chart around it and give authorities and all that sort of thing. But there's a risk with centers of excellence that the excellence that they purvey gets stale. And so there isn't an easy way to ensure that they're always reaching for what they need to do to stay current, to take advantage of things that are now available. So that would be an example of it's still the Ulrich model, but am I missing in how it is that my operating model accounts for each of those different pieces, parts? Am I actually getting at what I need to from those essential components? And if not, how do I incentivize it? And that may not be a changed operating model, but it might be something that you have to take action on. So, and particularly in federal government where centers of excellence are a norm, you see that, you have the hiring function and you have the learning and development function and chief learning officer. And these are kind of codified things that you would expect to see in any human capital office. How is it that you teach them or allow them and enable them to be innovative? Right. So it's a long answer to your question, but I think there are lots of operating models that work. Form has to follow function. You have to figure out what the functions are that you need to be performed, and you can codify that in an operating model. But in the end, I agree with the premise of the article, which is these are the three basic components, and you still need to have those basic components. The question is, how are they doing? And is it good enough? So
What did you think, Scott?
Well, I mean, this article is not for me. Like, I see this sort of stuff. It's just not built for me. The same if I see like a performance management article,
Scott doesn't care.
an article about Taylor Swift, I'm like, it's just not for me. So everything that follows is just take it with a grain of salt. And I did make it about halfway through, and my thoughts were like, these different operating models proposed by, vendors, whomever, who don't have to live with the fucking results, right? And there's no one size fits all, like Jane says. If I don't think things have to be this complicated. Everything should start with the mission, vision, strategy of the organization, and then everything should flow from there. There's not going to be a good operating model for everybody that works the exact same way. It's all going to be different, and that takes a lot of forethought and self-reflection, etc. But that's how I would suggest it for a guy that says he don't give a shit. So that's me.
Yeah. Well, I think there's a little truth in what you're saying about, the whole consulting model is create the problem and then create the solution to the problem that you invented. And so I think a lot of these operating models are trying to fix a solution that the consulting firms themselves invented.
Well, you selected this article. What do you think about it? Like, I mean, is this the way?
I think, one of the things that I personally find funny is that Dave Ulrich himself has come out with like 6 different operating models since the one he originally proposed. And it's like, dude, you got to stick with the original. Like, the band's got to play the greatest hits, man. Like, nobody's coming to see the Rolling Stones play their new song, right? But I don't know. There's a little bit of me that says a lot of this is about. And I've been following Mark Efron's work for quite some time, and he's got a few books that I thought were pretty fantastic. A lot of it, the theme is simplicity and execution. All right. So keep it simple,
absolutely.
Create a model that everybody understands and wants to use, and then execute. And I think what a lot of times HR does is the exact opposite, where they overcomplexify and they want to pontificate or iterate or what have you, and they don't have the execution focus, and it's too complicated. And so I think that's really where my head is at when it comes to how to do these things. But it seems like this topic may be getting a little boring to you guys. So Scott, do you have an article about boredom that you want to talk about?
Oh, dang, that's a solid transition, dude.
I know. I've been working on it.
This one's called Fast Forward to Boredom. It's a Journal of Experimental Psychology, which, hey, that's pretty cool, man. Big time. But, we all experience boredom. Cole saw my face a while ago, and we were talking about, structuring organizations, and he could sense it there. One way we commonly alleviate boredom is to turn to our phones, right? We're all guilty of this. And we think that's going to alleviate our boredom, but maybe not. These researchers tested whether switching digital media, so you're talking like YouTube videos or TikToks, whatever, actually alleviates boredom. They did 7 different studies. It was all pre-registered. Cole loves that. And it's quite a lengthy article. I made it a little way into it anyway, through a few of the studies. But the overall results suggest that... What's up?
I said, man, 7 studies. It's like, come on, do you want me to just quit?
This is one of the I almost guarantee it was either someone's like dissertation, and like the professor kept saying like keep going, or the journal was like, you need another study here before you finally get published. But the overall results suggest that board participants did switch videos. 2, they believe that switching videos would alleviate the boredom, but actually switching videos, and that they engineered these videos to be either interesting or boring, led to greater boredom. So actually, trying to constantly switch actually led to more boredom overall.
Mm-hmm.
I think this is the story of 2024 in a nutshell, which is everybody's on their phones. They think it's going to help them not be bored. and then all it's doing is actually creating a feedback loop to make them more bored. I love seeing this when you put it out there, Scott. I was like, this tracks. This is so good. I didn't need 7 studies. I could have done it with 3. This is so good. I know, Jane, what do you think about this? Like, is this relevant for your life or for the lives that you see out in society?
Absolutely. I think it's relevant for people who are in the middle of their careers, early in their careers, after their careers are over, certainly our children. And I think that boredom is not in and of itself a bad thing. I mean, when we were young, I remember sitting at home and yelling to my mom that I was bored. And she wisely did nothing to alleviate my boredom or to make me feel better about it. What she did was she left me to my own devices. And lo and behold, I found things to do and stopped being bored. So it required me to find things that I didn't mind doing, either alone or with others. And from there, I found what I actually wanted to do. And then that helped form who I was. And so I think boredom plays a really important role in the lives of our children as they grow, to learning to deal with boredom, because it is nature's way of getting you to understand what you want to do yourself and fix it yourself. And I think that is also true as you go into adulthood and into a career. Being bored in a job for a while might tell you something about what you need to be doing. And that could include switching job roles or switching companies or switching your life's purpose or whatever. But in the end, we will remember and feel satisfied by those things that we are truly engaged in. So if you look at like when the Mars rovers land on Mars and they have pictures of the teams, celebrating the fact that they've had a successful landing on Mars, that there's something that is otherworldly but you could feel it with them, right?
Literally otherworldly.
I mean, it was otherworldly, but it was otherworldly on Earth, meaning this sense of such deep purpose, like experiences to remember until your last breath. And that's the ideal. The ideal is that you're connected to things, whether it's at work or in your outside of work life, or as is the case with me, I'm sort of semi-retired, right? I'm not a full-time employee anywhere. I dabble. But what I'm trying to do is to figure out, I don't want to be bored, but I know that a certain amount of boredom is necessary for me to then sift through all the things that I could do and decide what it is that matters the most.
Well, there's a reason why like shower thoughts are a thing, right? Like that's like the one time, it depends on the person, but it's a time where you're not inundated with stimulus, right?
Right.
Yeah. I feel like the modern parenting advice that comes from this article is you better watch that YouTube video all the way to the end. You better not switch in the middle. We're in this household, we watch YouTube videos all the way through.
Have you ever gotten someone like on like a no roll? Like you ask them to do something, they're like, no. Well, how about this? No. How about this? No. And like you can even ask them something like that would benefit them. They'd be like, no. It's like, oh, you're just like caught up in this no roll. I feel the same way about like videos. We're like, no, next one, no, nothing's gonna satisfy me.
Yep.
Yeah. There's probably a lot of truth in that, actually. Well, Jane, you were talking about, what it's like, you're not in a full-time role right now. So I don't know how relevant this one will be to you, but we've got an article about why starting a new job feels so awkward, which I think probably some of the wisdom in here probably applies to life changes and career changes and that type of thing too. But this is from a Harvard Business Review article. And one of the things that they talk about in here is they say your prediction engine fails, right? So you start a new job, and in your old job, you're able to predict kind of with a pretty high likelihood what things are going to be like, how people are going to act, what people are going to say. And what this lack of your ability to predict that creates anxiety. And one of the lines in here I thought was really interesting because they kind of tied it together. They said, it's the same reason why foreign travel is often more fun in retrospect than it is in the moment. Is because in the moment you're feeling a ton of
Stressful.
anxiety, but after the fact, your prediction engine is working. They also say you don't know the language of the business necessarily. You don't have your squad yet, i.e., your group of friends. And that's what makes switching jobs, a little bit more difficult. I don't know. Scott, does this track for you in terms of switching and what you think about why starting a new job is awkward?
Yeah, I mean, like squarely, it's the cognitive load, right? Like everything's new, everything that they covered. So like you got new tools, new people. Like you don't know who the power players are, or who you can really trust. Like who can you like just kind of like be real with? Who can you not? It's funny going to a new organization. Like they act like they invented everything, or like how the data structured and everything. Like you wouldn't know like specific intricacies of it. I mean, like combine that with like you probably lied to them in the interview process, and they probably lied to you in the interview process. You're trying to like fake it till you make it. Like there's all sorts of shit going on. You don't even know where the bathroom is in a lot of cases. Like, yeah, there's a lot going on to start a new job. Absolutely.
I don't know. Does this track for life transitions that you've gone through, Jane?
Yeah, it's actually really relevant because even though it was my choice, I decided it's time to retire, and I left full-time employment, and I left the agency I'd been with for 16 years. And I mean, it's a big move. And I didn't have anything specifically lined up for what comes next professionally. And I could have said, okay, no more professional work. I'm going to just, I don't know, throw myself into hobbies and do other things that I haven't been able to do. But I decided not to do that, but to do some kind of composite. I mean, there are different pieces, parts of what I'm doing now, and they don't all add up to full time. But what resonated in the article with that transition for me was this idea of being a little anxious and actually a little uncertain. And you'd think, oh, after all these years of working in various different places with lots of new starts, surely that was easy for you. But actually, it isn't, because so much is contextual. I knew how to do HR when I was sitting in NASA because I learned it there. But if I did HR somewhere else, would it be the same? And I have found that I have to be, there are really three things that I've been purposeful about doing. One, which they mentioned in the article, is create a set of allies. I don't know if they use the word allies, but I
think they actually did. Yeah.
And so I actually literally created a list of people that I wanted to stay in touch with, that most of whom came from my NASA experience, but not all. And so, and I would have coffees and I'd have virtual chats, and it was largely just social. It wasn't, pumping them for stuff. That's not me. But it was the idea of having a community in this segment of my life, which required me to really be deliberate about it. Right. Yeah. The other thing was going back to being a student again. Whenever you start a new job, however senior you have been, there's always stuff that you don't know, and you have to be willing to feel a little foolish sometimes, right?
Yeah.
And feel it's uncomfortable. Some of what you have to do is uncomfortable. Like, geez, did I work for all of those years to that now have to be doing this thing and feeling uncomfortable about it? And the answer is yes, you do. And actually, it's okay. There's like a self-forgiveness part of this that they didn't speak to in the article, but which is, I feel like, forgive yourself for feeling anxious and insecure. It's okay,
Yeah.
So, right? It's not like you're a bad person or you failed or somehow you're different than everybody else. It's not true. And the third thing that I thought of in reading this article and applying it to where I am now is this idea of being willing to try things and saying yes. So I kind of walked into my semi-retirement and said, if things come my way, unless there's a good reason to say no, I'm going to say yes. And so
you ended up on this podcast.
So like this. No, I'm just kidding.
Yeah, exactly.
So anyway, and that is, I think it's paid off for me in that I think I've a year and a half. How long is it now? Yeah, a year and a half later, I feel like I have a really good rhythm. I do have a community. I do feel intellectually engaged. I do feel like I have a support network.
The rhythm is really key, right? Because
Yeah.
that's what you really don't know. Like you don't know what meetings you can skip or what are optional. Everything just
Right.
is so fresh, and like just trying to get from like 8 a.m. to 5 p.m. is such a wishy-washy experience early on.
Well, yes. And there's a lot of administration. You don't
Yeah.
have just one calendar and one set of people come to you for meetings. It's like this whole mishmash. And I have 3 computers and 4 calendars. And, it's just not to mention having to deal with technology interruptions and not being as tech savvy as other people are, and having to, I do luckily have family members who step in and provide me with a lot of gracious help. But anyway, so there was some funny things like that. But in the end, I think I've been satisfied with what I have done and with the tempo and the mix of things that I'm doing. So that was lucky.
Clearly starting a new job is like really kind of stressful. Like, Cole, do you have any like strategies that you employ or like techniques?
Well, I think actually the wisdom that Jane put out there was really good.
That is really good.
First of all, I think, you didn't use this word, but I think the beginner's mindset is really key. And you also said the forgiveness part. I always say, give yourself some grace.
Yeah.
Because like you can't be expected to know things that you just don't know.
Right.
Mhm.
Right. And the article talks a lot about acronyms. I feel like that's a really kind of low stakes version of like, oh, you just don't know the jargon of the new organization. But really, there's so many things, culture wise, like process wise, like, Scott, you mentioned like you don't know which meetings you can skip and that type of stuff, that you just don't know what's inbounds and out of bounds.
Mhm.
Right.
And it takes a little while of bumping up against the walls in the dark to figure that out. I'll say this on a personal note. One of the reasons why I chose this article is because, by the time this podcast comes out, it will be live. I'm starting a new job soon. And so I thought that this would be really relevant again in terms of giving myself some grace. We can probably get into the machinations of that in the next Cole and Scott episode, because I wanted to make sure that we, focused on you today, Jane. But that's a big announcement in my world. And so this is all very relevant. And I love the stuff that you shared a minute ago, Jane. That was excellent in terms of as I navigate this transition as well.
Cole's gonna be the new Chico at NASA. It's gonna be
No, or not. That would be really cool, though, I imagine. But Jane, this has been fantastic having you on as a guest today. Before I give you the final word, Scott, any parting words for Jane?
Jane's been lovely. How can folks reach out to you? Should they care to?
Well, I'm on LinkedIn, so that's a really quick and easy way to do it. And, feel free to share my email if people ask you for contact information. So I think you have it already, so that's totally fine. So anyway, it's been really fun talking to both of you. I mean, I've learned from what you've shared, and I love the set of topics that you teed up. It went to a lot of different places, and so it kept it interesting. Back to where we started today's conversation about it. I didn't feel it was stale. I was engaged. I wasn't bored.
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, we're pretty awesome.
I just think it's really fun. I mean, this is different than the other kinds of podcasts that I have done, where it's a little bit more structured around, how long it will last and the flow. And so this was just a novel experience, and I enjoyed it a great deal. So thank you.
Well, I appreciate that. Well, I'll tell you this. If you're listening, if you reach out to Jane, she will say yes. You heard it from her earlier. So, please reach out to her. She's already committed. But
I'm pre-committed.
Jane, you're a fantastic leader in this space, and I really appreciate you. And thank you so much for joining us today. But you've been listening to Directionally Correct, People Analytics podcast with Cole and Scott, and today's guest, Jane Datta. Thanks for joining us, Jane.
Pleasure.
Directionally Correct is dedicated to you, our listeners, to help educate and entertain you on how to effectively do people analytics. By supporting this podcast, you are helping us continue to provide valuable insights and knowledge to our listeners. Please consider becoming a patron of the podcast. You can find the link to sign up in the show notes or at patron.podbean.com/directionallycorrect. Thanks for your support.